this video, we're going to talk about some of the different kinds of paper that you can print your images on. While there are some technical and objective differences between the paper, this is often a subjective choice. People tend to have their favorites when it comes to choosing paper, and you'll probably find that some images work best on one kind of paper and some images work best on another. The only way to really find out what your favorites are is through experience, so the best thing you can do is lots of prints. This, however, can be expensive and you might not know where to start. So this video will be a little bit of a guide to help you making those initial steps when it comes to your printing journey. When comparing the papers today, we'll be using a standardized printer evaluation image. This image has a whole heap of different colors and tones on it so that we can compare the different papers and find out what they're actually doing to the photos that we're putting on top of them. All the images you'll see in the video today have been shot under reproduction conditions, so we'll have the most accurate results when it comes to comparing each photo. We'll also look at them on a neutral grey background so that our eyes can easily absorb the differences in colour and tones in the prints. There are several different choices you have with the paper available to you at RMIT, and this may vary a little bit depending on whether you're wanting to print on a roll or print on a sheet. Canson Rag Photographique is a 100% cotton-based paper with a smooth matte surface. It has a 310 GSM weight and a thickness of 466 microns. Canson Platine Fibre Rag is a 100% cotton-based paper with a smooth satin finish. It has a 310 GSM weight and a thickness of 395 microns. Canson Brighter is an alpha cellulose and cotton blend paper with an extra smooth satin surface. It has a 310 GSM weight and a thickness of 370 microns. Brighter is unique in that it is designed to closely mimic the look and feel of analog prints. Canson High Gloss is an alpha cellulose based paper with an ultra smooth glossy surface. It has a 315 GSM weight and a thickness of 279 microns. Canson Aquarelle is a 100% cotton based paper with a heavily textured matte surface. It has a 240 GSM weight and a thickness of 468 microns. Canson Etching Edition is a 100% cotton-based paper with a textured matte surface. It has a 310 GSM weight and a thickness of 479 microns. Ilford Pearl is a resin-coated paper with a smooth satin surface. It has a 310 GSM weight and a thickness of 310 microns. The weight and thickness of the paper stock you choose shouldn't be your primary consideration. However, it does change the sturdiness of the paper. Generally, the thicker and heavier a paper is, the more sturdy it will be. Sturdy papers tend to have a better feel in the hands, and these are often a sign of quality when it comes to photographic prints. Sturdy papers are also much less likely to kink, and this can be something that can be particularly useful when you're doing really large prints, as these have a tendency to kink and can be difficult to handle. All of the papers available at RMIT are fairly good in this respect, however some are more sturdy than others. Etching Edition is the sturdiest paper that we have available, and High Gloss is the least sturdy. One of the biggest differences between matte and glossy papers is the way that their surfaces reflect light. Glossy papers are specular, and as such will reflect the light sources illuminating them to some degree. Papers like Platine, Brighter, and Pearl will produce a more diffuse highlight, meaning any hotspots will be less intense but more spread out than the highly specular papers like High Gloss. High Gloss has a mirror-like surface resulting in intense, localized highlights. One of the large benefits of matte papers is that we avoid this problem. These highlights can be unsightly, and if you're getting a lot of hotspots on your prints, then this can disengage the viewer from the actual content of the image. This can be controlled somewhat by the positioning of the lights that you're using. However, in some galleries this can be difficult to manage and you might have to deal with immovable light sources like windows as well. Another attribute of the surface of the paper is its texture, and some papers are highly textural whereas others have very little texture at all. There is a good range of different textures both in their intensity and pattern available to print at RMIT. Aquarelle is the most textural to the point of having almost a canvas-like quality, whereas High Gloss is almost textureless. The matte papers tend to be more textural than their glossy counterparts, however there is plenty of variation in texture available in both types of paper. It should also be noted that the images shown here have been shot to exaggerate the texture of the paper, and in practical viewing scenarios you'll likely find the grain is much less pronounced. Highly textured paper will give you that real papery feel, and the texture of the paper will become a large focal point of the final print. Another thing to consider besides the intensity of the texture is the actual pattern itself. Aquarelle and pearl, for example, have a fairly repetitive pattern, whereas platine, rag photographique, baryta, and etching feel more organic. Too much texture might take away from the actual content of your image, so you need to balance the texture of the paper with the photo itself. The paper that you choose can also have an effect on the overall sharpness of your image as well, with some papers having a slightly softer or a slightly sharper look. If you're wanting to make prints where even the smallest of details are produced with spectacular crispness, then a matte paper is likely a better choice. Matte papers tend to produce sharper prints than their glossy counterparts, with a depth of detail that can be easy to get lost in. Practically speaking, you need to get pretty close to a print to see such a difference. However, if you're wanting viewers to really stick their nose right up to your works and observe the small intricacies of an image, then reproducing photos with the utmost detail is an important factor. Even incredibly textural papers like aquarelle will still produce sharper images than glossy paper like baryta. As a rule of thumb, the glossier the paper, the less detail will be reproduced. Again, this isn't always the case when it comes to practical scenarios, as the shadows created by the texture of certain papers may actually hide some of that sharpness that's hidden in the print. So far it seems like matte is the clear winner when it comes to papers. However, there is one advantage that glossy has, and it's a pretty big one. Glossy papers have a much bigger tonal range than what matte papers do. This means on glossy papers, you'll get deeper blacks and brighter highlights than you will on their matte counterparts. This can often make matte papers look dull and lifeless when compared directly to a glossy print. While this can be fixed somewhat with the editing of your photos, you'll never achieve those deep, rich blacks with matte papers that you will with glossy ones. Glossy papers often have a three-dimensional feel where the image really leaps from the print. If you are printing an image with heavy, detail-rich shadows or deep dark hues, such as found in this still life, then you may want to go with a glossy paper so these tones don't become muddied. You'll also find images with subtle variations in texture and tone pop more with glossy papers, like we see in the spherical object contained in this black and white image. Highlights are also typically brighter on glossy papers, although in this respect there isn't such a clear-cut winner. The duller highlights of matte papers can often produce richer looking colours. Take these skin tones for example. The highlights of the skin are reproduced much darker on matte papers. This, along with matte paper's tendency to smooth out subtle variation in textures and tone, produces a softer looking image, which can often be more flattering for portraits. This is particularly the case for the fair and tan skin types, although is less of a case for the darker skin. Darker skin begins to fall victim to the poor black point of matte papers, and this portrait looks a little bit muddy compared to its glossy counterpart. For another example, the bright colours in the yellow landscape look deep and rich in the matte paper, and these veer towards slightly fluorescent in the glossy reproduction. With the darker colours of the strawberries though, the matte paper loses that sheen that's present in the glossy paper, and they don't quite give you that mouth-watering feel in the matte as they do in the glossy. This is where the right decision becomes a little bit trickier, because it becomes more of a personal choice. It is good though to know how colours and tone will be affected by matte and glossy papers, so that you can choose the right paper for the kind of look that you're wanting to get out of your prints. Alongside the colour and contrast that papers reproduce, there's also the whiteness and brightness of the paper itself. This can be a little bit of a tricky topic because of these things called optical brightening agents, or OBAs. OBAs are chemicals that are put into papers to give them more whiteness. There is a catch however, because for OBAs to work, they need to be in the presence of ultraviolet light. This means that papers with OBAs can appear bright and white under certain conditions, like when they're being illuminated by the sun, but they can actually appear more dull when they're illuminated by artificial light sources without ultraviolet in the spectrum. A typical photographic paper before an OBA is introduced veers towards a yellowish or warmish tone. OBAs contain blue, which is the complementary colour to yellow, so when these two things are combined, we get a more neutral looking white. If there is a lack of ultraviolet light to activate these OBAs though, then this blueness in the paper becomes really prominent, and it'll make your prints look cool and dull. What does this mean in practice? Well, it means that if you're using paper with OBAs, then the light you're viewing it under will actually change the look of the final print. This is particularly obvious with images with lots of bright tones because we're going to get lots of the paper showing through underneath the ink. Canson Baryta contains a small amount of OBAs, whereas Canson High Gloss and Ilford Pearl contain significant amounts. In my tests, photographing these paper under strict and controlled conditions without any ultraviolet light, we see results that mirror what was previously discussed. Platine, Rag Photographique, Aquarelle and Etching all appear bright and warm. High Gloss and Pearl, which have the most amount of OBAs, appear dull and cool. And Baryta, with a small amount of OBA, is probably the brightest and whitest of the bunch. An easy way to start choosing the kind of paper that you're wanting to use is by soft proofing on Lightroom or Photoshop using the printing profiles for that specific paper. This will give you a preview of what the image looks like, and although the experience is always different looking at prints versus looking at screens, at least it'll point you in the right direction. Another thing this will do is help you start to edit your file so that it looks best for a particular kind of paper. Today we looked at a standardized image to compare different photos, and this means that I didn't edit the photo before actually printing so that we could see the difference quite clearly. This won't be the case when you're doing your own prints because you'll actually be editing the photos to give you the best result for printing on a certain kind of paper. Another thing to think about is when you're viewing your prints while you're printing to get that perfect reproduction, you want to make sure that you're viewing them under a neutral and even light source. You'll find plenty of these in the rooms throughout RMIT, so make sure you're looking at your prints under these rather than just looking at them in the normal room light. If you want any more advice or a second opinion on which kind of paper you should choose, then make sure you talk to one of the techs or talk to your tutor, and they'll be able to give you a hand. Otherwise, the best thing you can do is just to print on lots of different kinds of paper and try lots of different kind of photos and see which ones you like yourself. Good luck with your printing. We look forward to seeing what you come up with your final prints.